I cannot explain why God would save one life and allow another one to be taken. I don't have the answer for that.
Franklin Graham has led disaster relief on every continent. He has delivered aid through wars, pandemics, and earthquakes, and built two of the largest evangelical organizations in the world. Millions have followed his name for more than 40 years. His wife Jane stood beside him through all of it, and for nearly 50 years she never stepped into any of the headlines herself. Then came a tragic diagnosis. When Jane Graham broke her silence, she left millions of fans in tears. What came with that silence, and what finally ended it, is where this story begins.
Thank you for your prayers, for your support, for your partnership. And as we come to the end of this year, I'm just so grateful as I look back and see where God has allowed us to be this year.
8 cities, 0 venues in 2020, Franklin Graham organized a tour of 8 cities across the United Kingdom. His organization called it the God Loves You Tour. Before a single event could take place, every one of the 8 venues canceled. The cancellations came one after another. A CC Liverpool canceled first, saying his views on LGBTQ+ issues were incompatible with our values. Glasgow canceled. Sheffield canceled. Milton Keynes pulled out. Newcastle's Utilita Arena was the last to go. By the time the tour dates arrived, Franklin Graham had no venues left in an entire country. Liverpool's mayor tweeted that the city was proud of its LGBT community and would not allow hatred to go unchallenged. Graham called it the work of a small but vocal minority. He issued an open letter to the LGBTQ community in the UK saying he was not bringing hateful speech, that everyone was welcome to hear the gospel. The venues did not change their position. The Billy Graham Evangelistic Association launched legal action against multiple venues, arguing the cancellations violated the UK Equality Act. The lawsuits took years to resolve. Eventually, several venues were compelled under legal pressure to reinstate their bookings. The God Loves You Tour went ahead in 2022, with protest events held simultaneously outside venues in multiple cities. In July 2024, Franklin Graham stood on the stage of the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee and led the opening prayer. He told the audience that Trump's survival of the assassination attempt that month was evidence of God's protection. He credited Trump directly for appointing the Supreme Court justices who provided the key votes to overturn Roe v. Wade. His father, Billy Graham, had counseled 12 presidents. He had never endorsed one from a stage. The people who had followed Franklin Graham for decades had watched him evolve from a man who left the Republican Party in disgust to a man who opened the Republican National Convention in prayer. Whether that arc represented conviction or compromise was no longer a question being debated quietly. It was the central argument about what the Graham name stood for. And it was not the only one. Through all of it, the lawsuits, the stage in Milwaukee, every headline that followed, there was a woman in Boone, North Carolina, who had kept her name out of every one of them. That restraint was about to become the most significant thing about the story. The woman who stayed quiet, Jane Graham, was born on Christmas Eve, 1950. She is 2 years older than Franklin, a detail that almost never surfaces in the decades of coverage of either of them. She grew up in Smithfield, North Carolina, and came to Montreat one summer in 1974. One Sunday, Franklin offered to drive her to church. That was how it started. She met his mother, Ruth Bell Graham, during that visit. Ruth had raised 5 children largely on her own, while Billy traveled the world. She read people with the accuracy that came from long practice. She approved of Jane immediately. Franklin and Jane married in August 1974. She did not come into his life as an additional complication. She came in as something that had been missing. They settled in Boone, North Carolina. They raised 4 children: William Franklin Graham IV, Roy Austin Graham, Edward B. Graham, and Jane Austen Graham Lynch, who goes by Sissy. All 4 children went into ministry. Franklin and Jane now have 13 grandchildren. Sissy later developed her own ministry platform and has spoken publicly about what life at home in Boone actually looked like. Whatever Franklin was navigating publicly that week, Jane's home operated on a different set of rules. The lines of communication stayed open. The table stayed set. Sissy has described her mother as the person who made sure the family could talk about anything, who drove them to school, who was at every game. While Franklin built an organization that touched millions of lives, Jane built the 4 people watching him do it. Franklin traveled into danger. The conflict zones and disaster regions his work required were not figurative. Because of that, the ministry holds a $1.3 million life insurance policy on Franklin, with Jane listed as the beneficiary. That document says something about the nature of their marriage that no amount of public praise ever could. She was not just the person who stayed home. She was the person named in the paperwork that acknowledged he might not come back. Jane did not appear in press profiles. She did not give long interviews. Staff at Samaritan's Purse described her as a consistent and quiet presence for the families of employees who spent extended periods away. She understood what that cost because she had been paying it herself since 1974. Ruth Bell Graham died in 2007 at the age of 87. Franklin spoke at her funeral. Jane stood beside him. They had been married for 33 years by then. The woman who had approved of Jane in Montreat that summer was gone. The world that had formed around that approval had survived every challenge it had faced. Or almost every challenge. She had married Franklin the year everything changed in him. She had only ever known what he built afterward. What he built was vast, contested, and not always transparent. What he built and what it cost. Samaritan's Purse carries net assets of $1.4 billion. The Billy Graham Evangelistic Association brings in more than $224 million every year. Franklin Graham leads both. Together, they represent one of the largest evangelical operations in the world. The BGEA changed its tax status to an association of churches in 2016 and no longer files a public IRS Form 990. Donors who want to know where their money goes have fewer answers than they once did. Franklin met Bob Pierce, the founder of Samaritan's Purse, in 1973. In 1975, Pierce invited him on a 6-week mission trip through South Korea, Hong Kong, and Borneo. He saw communities shattered by famine and war. Franklin joined the Samaritan's Purse Board in 1978. Pierce died of leukemia on September 6, 1978. More than a year later, in October 1979, the board elected Franklin president. He was 27 years old. The growth under his leadership was significant. So was the scrutiny. In 1992, the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability suspended Samaritan's Purse while it investigated the ministry's finances. One of the specific concerns, a $40,000 bequest from a Texas woman, had been deposited into Graham's personal bank account. Graham said the check arrived with his name on it and was intended for him personally. The investigation was resolved. The questions about money were not. In 2001, Franklin took on the additional role of CEO of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. He was already running Samaritan's Purse. Nonprofit watchdog Ole Anthony of the Trinity Foundation said it was ludicrous to think he could do 2 jobs at that level. By 2008, his combined salary from both organizations exceeded $500,000. It became public. Franklin agreed to give up his BGEA salary to end the conversation. He said the controversy just wasn't worth it. Today, Ministry Watch ranks him 11th on its list of highest-paid Christian ministry executives. His compensation from Samaritan's Purse alone exceeds $832,000. Because the BGEA no longer files a Form 99. What he draws from that organization is not publicly known. He was ordained in 1982, named Vice President of the BGEA in 1995, named Chief Executive in 2000. He built the largest version of his father's world that the world had ever seen. The question about what he did with it was being asked by people close enough to have standing to ask it. Some of them shared his last name. The family that pushed back. By December 2019, the loudest voices calling Franklin Graham's direction into question were not coming from outside the evangelical world. They were coming from the grandchildren of Billy Graham. Aram Chividian is the son of Billy's oldest daughter, Gigi Graham Chividian. His sister is Jerusha Duford. Both had written about their grandfather's ministry. Both had raised pointed questions about whether Franklin's version of that legacy matched what they had witnessed growing up. Their criticism did not come with distance. It came with standing. The moment that made the rift public was Franklin's response to a December 2019 editorial in Christianity Today. The piece, written by editor-in-chief Mark Galli, called for Trump's removal from office. The magazine had been founded by Billy Graham in 1956. Franklin responded within hours on social media, calling the editorial disgraceful and disclosing for the first time that his father had known Trump, believed in him, and voted for him in 2016. Aram posted a response on Twitter. He described, with unmistakable sarcasm, a remarkable day in 2016 when his grandfather, deep in the late stages of Parkinson's disease, had apparently risen from bed for the first time in a year, driven himself to the polling station, and cast his ballot. A reader publicly asked Franklin whether his nephew was calling him a liar. Franklin did not retreat. That exchange didn't come from nowhere. It had been building since at least 2011. In March 2011, Franklin Graham appeared on Newsmax and claimed that officials in the Obama administration had connections to the Muslim Brotherhood, and that the Brotherhood had infiltrated every level of our government. He separately refused to affirm publicly that President Obama was a Christian. The NAACP issued a formal letter accusing Graham of trying to use faith as a weapon of political division. He later apologized for casting doubt on the president's faith. In December 2015, Franklin announced he was leaving the Republican Party. He registered as an independent, saying he had no hope in either major party and was disgusted by a GOP-led Congress that had funded Planned Parenthood. Within months, he was one of Donald Trump's most prominent evangelical supporters. The party he left in December he was campaigning for by the following spring. After January 6, 2021, as Franklin tweeted suggesting Antifa was responsible for the Capitol attack, thousands of people signed a petition calling for him to be fired from both Samaritan's Purse and the BGEA. He kept both jobs. He kept every position. The man at the center of all of it had not always been this person. Every one of those positions, every controversy, every petition had roots in a decision made alone in a hotel room in Jerusalem in 1974. That story was its own kind of explanation. Where it started. None of the controversy, the money, the lawsuits, the petitions, the RNC stage, any of it, was where Franklin Graham was supposed to end up. His father filled stadiums and counseled presidents. Franklin spent his early 20s being expelled from colleges and drinking his way through Europe. He called it the fast life. The people close to him, called it something closer to grief. He later said the fear of being compared to Billy Graham and found lacking was enough to drive him away from ministry entirely. He enrolled at LeTourneau College in Longview, Texas, and was expelled for keeping a female classmate out past curfew. 2 schools, 2 exits that weren't his idea. The turn came in 1974. Billy took him on a trip to Switzerland and told Franklin directly that he and Ruth both sensed there was a struggle going on for the direction of his life, and that the choice would have to come from Franklin himself. Franklin was still moving through Europe with what he later described as a bottle of scotch in hand. Those words followed him anyway. He arrived in Jerusalem. One night he stayed in his room, picked up a Bible, opened it to the Gospel of John, and read chapter 3, where Jesus tells Nicodemus that no one can see the kingdom of God unless he is born again. Alone in a hotel room at 22 with no audience, he later said it landed differently. He understood the message was for him. He knelt beside the bed and prayed. He wrote about that night in his 1995 autobiography, Rebel with a Cause. Finally comfortable being Graham. He had spent years putting distance between himself and the Graham identity. The book was his admission that all that distance had led him back to the same room his father had always been standing in. He would spend the next 50 years answering that question in public, loudly, and without apology. In 2021, he could not speak for himself. His wife spoke for him. What Jane told the world. In 2021, Franklin Graham was diagnosed with constrictive pericarditis. The pericardium is a thin sac of tissue that wraps around the heart and protects it. In constrictive pericarditis, that tissue becomes inflamed and slowly hardens. As it stiffens, it squeezes the heart from the outside. The heart can't fill properly between beats. It can't pump the way it should. What was designed to protect the organ starts to work against it. The only treatment is to remove it entirely. Franklin was 69 years old at the time of the diagnosis. He underwent open-heart surgery in November of that year. The day after the surgery, Franklin posted on Facebook. He had 9.6 million followers on the platform. He had used it to file political opinions, endorse candidates, and respond to family disputes. This post read differently. Yesterday, I underwent a specialized heart surgery at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. The surgery involved removing the pericardium, and we thank God that it went well. My doctors said I should expect a full recovery, and will be able to return to my normal ministry schedule. I appreciate everyone's prayers. Jane spoke publicly about the diagnosis and the surgery. For a woman who had spent 47 years keeping her life away from the press, it was a significant departure. She had not spoken through the controversies or the family disputes or the petitions or the UK lawsuits. She spoke now because her husband had gone into open-heart surgery, and the people who had followed his ministry for 30 years needed to know. For 47 years, nothing Franklin Graham had done or been accused of had pulled her into the frame. A surgery did what 30 years of controversy could not. The evangelical community that had spent years divided along the same fault lines Franklin had helped create paused, at least briefly. The people who had signed petitions calling for his removal sent messages of prayer. The arguments about who Franklin Graham was gave way, for a moment, to something simpler. Messages came from across the country and from outside it. From families in disaster zones who had received food or shelter or medical care from Samaritan's Purse teams when no other help arrived. From people who had agreed with everything Franklin had ever said, and from people who had stopped agreeing years before. It reminded millions of people that behind the platform and the politics and the petitions, there was a man. and the woman who had stood beside him for 47 years, the woman named on a $1.3 million life insurance policy because of the places he traveled to, had finally stepped forward to say so. What came next was a question the ministry had been building toward for years, and the man who was supposed to answer it was standing near Swannanoa, waiting. The next Graham, Franklin Graham, is now in his early 70s. He has led the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association for more than 2 decades and Samaritan's Purse for more than 4. His oldest son, Will Graham, serves as Executive Vice President of the BGEA and Director of the Billy Graham Training Center at the Cove near Swannanoa, just east of Asheville. Before taking on those roles, Will served for 6 years as pastor of Wakefield Baptist Church in Wake Forest, North Carolina, not Raleigh, where he had spent one earlier year as a pastoral intern. He is an ordained minister with an active international preaching schedule. People who have seen him speak note the same things: the physical resemblance to his grandfather, the cadence, the pauses. If Franklin were unable to continue, Will is the designated successor. The transition is not a hypothetical. What remains unresolved is the fracture inside the family. Aram Chividian and Jerusha Duford have not walked back their criticisms. The Christianity Today rift has no formal resolution. The argument about what the Graham name requires and who defines what it represents is still being made by people with a claim on it. The financial picture of what Will would inherit is significant and deliberately opaque. Since 2016, the BGEA has filed no public Form 990. Samaritan's Purse, which does file publicly, carried net assets of $1.4 billion in its most recent audit. The full scale of the combined operation is not publicly known. In October 2025, Franklin withdrew both organizations from the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, the body Billy Graham helped co-found in 1979. He refused to comply with a new standard requiring organizations to develop a care plan for their senior leader, including regular spiritual oversight. He said the standard dealt with matters outside ECFA's expertise. His father built the accountability infrastructure. His son walked out of it. Jane Graham is still in Boone. 4 children raised, all 4 in ministry, 13 grandchildren. A marriage now past 50 years. When he went into surgery in November of 2021, she spoke. When he came out of it, she went back to being quiet. The woman millions had been watching all along, without fully realizing it, had done what she had always done. She stayed. Franklin Graham changed the direction of his life in a Jerusalem hotel room at 22. His wife has spent the 50 years since holding what the headlines couldn't carry. When the diagnosis came and Jane finally spoke, the response said something the controversy never could. Millions had been watching her all along, even when she wasn't there to see it. Whether the Graham family closes the divide that opened so publicly is still unanswered. Leave your thoughts below.